Are you calling that right now for sure?
I think I'm
I
for
mean,
sure on this week.
huh?
Yeah, I think I'm for sure.
What's up, everyone? Welcome into another D3 Datacast. The conference season is rolling on. We're settling into conference play deep into a Division Three basketball season, but I don't think the landscape is settling whatsoever, Matt. I'm just going to sit back and relax as you try to work your way through another top 25 ballot. I'm just going to sit back and enjoy it and not worry about having to put one together. I'm not a voter. You are. That's your problem. But hey, at least one of us is a voter. That gives us something to talk about. And all the better that I'm not the one who has to try to actually figure it out.
Yeah, there are some weeks that it is easy to put together a top 25 ballot. There are some weeks that are more difficult. I would say this week tended more toward the difficult side of things with what we saw in the top 25 landscape. So, why don't I walk us through my top 25 ballot if you're ready for that, Zach?
I'm ready.
Yeah, so this week we saw, I think, two notable, very notable losses up at the top of my ballot. My number one last week was Emory. My number two was UW Platteville. They both lost this week. Emory actually lost two times this week. But I had snidely said to someone that I don't have to change my number one after UW Platteville had lost on Wednesday because I'm rolling with Emory here. I was the correct guy that had number one, and then Emory goes and loses twice in the UAA. So things shuffled around a bit on my ballot. I'll take you through it. I'll read it 1 through 25 for the audio only people, and then we'll talk a little bit. But I have Wesleyan at the top, Trine number two, Illinois Wesleyan number three, Wash U number four, UW Platteville five, Randolph Macon at number six, Emory at number seven, Wisconsin Lutheran at number eight, NYU at number nine, Hampton Sydney at number 10, UW La Crosse 11, St. John's 12, Trinity Connecticut 13, Tufts 14, Christopher Newport 15, Denison at number 16, Virginia Wesleyan 17, John Carroll 18, Cal Lutheran 19, U Chicago back into my ballot at number 20, Keene State number 21, WPI 22, St. Thomas of Texas 23, Redlands 24, and coming in at number 25 is Calvin.
So let's start right there at the top, Matt. Wesleyan is your new number one. They of course got a big win over Trinity, Connecticut, an important NESCAC win. Really, I think puts them in the driver's seat for the NESCAC regular season championship. With that single round robin, I pointed this out on social media. Every win is like an automatic tiebreaker as well because there's no second game where you can get that season split. So Wesleyan has beaten Trinity, and now 2 games ahead of Trinity. So you got to feel like if you're the Bantams, a run through a NESCAC tournament is going to be, in that neutral court road situation and not at home. That's a big result here as we get towards the NESCAC conference tournament. Matt, just let's not go any further. Let's just talk about your thought process in terms of making Wesleyan your new number one.
Yeah, well, this right away, you mentioned it, that Trinity game. That was the first big one we wanted to see out of Wesleyan. Wesleyan, I think, kind of rose into the year as one of those computer darlings where the calculations like them, they're beating teams that are, let's just maybe middling. I don't want to group everyone into that, but just a bunch of teams by big numbers, right? So the computers like them, but the human voters are not quite sure. Are they for sure? Are they legit or not? Trinity is a team we saw in the Final Four last year. They looked strong in the early part of the season. They still look strong. I still have them kind of in the middle of my ballot there. But for Wesleyan to go on the road and win that game by 9, I think for me that was a strong point of, yes, Wesleyan looks like they're for sure. They look like they're one of these teams that can be in charge of the NESCAC. I think there's still a lot to say in that conference race ahead of us. They still have a big game against Tufts coming up. But for Wesleyan to go and get that win in particular, I think for me that was enough, especially with the losses we talked about previously, to put them in position to be the number one ranked team on my ballot.
You followed up with number two there, Trine, Matt, setting up a big game between Trine and Calvin on Wednesday to finish the first round of conference play in the MIAA season. Both those two teams have gotten to this point 6-0, so one of them will finish that first half of conference play undefeated. The other one will take a loss there, and try and really finish out the week strong with a convincing home win over Hope. Just I think to large degree, kind of doing what Trine has been doing most of the season. They've certainly had number one consideration coming off the championship last year, and they've been right there in the mix. How you feeling about Trine and the rest of the MIAA race here?
Yeah, that win against Hope was certainly impressive, right? I think Calvin clearly tired out Hope on Wednesday night, so that was why Trine had such the big win. I say that jokingly. No, Trine's been good all season, right? They have just the one loss. I think it was like 2 or 3 points against UW Stevens Point in non-conference play. Stevens Point is a team that did fall out of my ballot this week, but has been in the D3Hoops.com top 25 poll for much of the year now. Kind of, I don't know if that win was one of the catalysts, but kind of around that time they had come in for good. So just the one loss against a pretty good team. Trine has been playing well all season long, and they were a team with high expectations coming into the season. After you said again they were the national champs last year, are having to go through what you hope no team ever has to go through, losing a teammate, Fred Garland, in the middle of the season. And that's one reason why I didn't want to just move Trine based on that tragic news and bring them down. They were gonna either keep playing like the team they were, or they weren't, and the results would fall out. Trine's still been great. They've had to deal with all of that, and they've put up great results in the MIAA. And this game against Hope meant it was just not just the bottom half of the MIAA. It was another good, solid, strong team in the MIAA, and that's going to set up a big game against Calvin this week as the conference kind of shifts through the first half, second half. And that's going to be another big game for Trine, but I think there's no reason why they shouldn't be considered the favorites going into that game at home down in Angola.
3 Illinois Wesleyan, Matt. Interesting here as I look at the next two names. It's a couple teams that Illinois Wesleyan has defeated head to head in Wash U and Platteville. That kind of makes for a tidy grouping there in that order. Illinois Wesleyan's got some great wins, including those two we mentioned, Washington over Wash U and Platteville. And probably just a loss down in Belton, Texas, away from number
Yeah.
one, strong number one. Because obviously, when you're third, you could easily vote them number one. But with the type of wins they have, that's maybe the one knock that sends them behind Wesleyan and Trine on your ballot. But they've got some wins, multiple wins, as good as anyone. How are you making sense of that trio there? Is it as simple as these teams are all really good? You see them as top five teams, and this is kind of the order you shake out with the head to head providing for a convenient way to separate that group.
Yeah, Illinois Wesleyan, those top three, those are all teams I considered for number one this week. I wasn't quite sure, was I going to go with Wesleyan? Would I consider Trine back at number one? Or would Illinois Wesleyan take the top spot for me? So those three, I think, are kind of a group on their own. And as you mentioned, it kind of makes for a clean break. I didn't think about this as I was putting the ballot together in that order. But yeah, they've already beaten Wash U and UW Platteville. They've got some really good wins under their belt. So yes, I think those three teams for me right now are pretty close at the top. Maybe not a huge gap right now to Wash U, except for the gaps that were on the scoreboard between Illinois Wesleyan and Wash U and Illinois Wesleyan and UW Platteville, to be honest. But those three teams, they're kind of in a group pretty tight, and things could shift. So I could definitely see a team like a Trine, if they go and if they take it to Calvin this week, or if Illinois Wesleyan, I don't know what their schedule is off the top of my head, but if they have big wins this week, those teams could jump Wesleyan, even if Wesleyan maybe does nothing wrong themselves.
Well, let's talk about big wins with Wash U, Matt, because they're a team through non-conference. I think we were waiting for what's that going to be, that big win on the Wash U resume. They had the loss to Illinois Wesleyan in what was their biggest chance at a top tier opponent through the non-conference. Of course, now we've gotten into UAA play, and you can kind of forgive maybe a less than non-conference schedule for a UAA team, because they're going to get everything they need out of a schedule just from their conference play. But really impressive for Wash U to not only win at Emory, but to get the road Sunday win at Emory. Of course, those Sunday road games in the UAA are as difficult as any. They're playing a crazy travel schedule. They got to make that trip from their Friday game to the Sunday game. Life on the road in the UAA is not easy, and for Wash U to go get that win at Emory. Now, I'll say for what I saw, I wasn't really as impressed with the way Emery was playing in general, and not to take away from the two opponents, Chicago and WashU, that they played this year, but it just seemed like they weren't playing at the level, irrespective of what those opponents may have been doing to them or forcing them into from what we saw earlier in the season out of Emery. But nonetheless, WashU gets that signature win. That I think we were really looking for, and to really cement them into that, the certainly top 10, but here top 5 for you this week.
Yeah, and a win down at Emory is super impressive for WashU. I think this is the first time that Emory really got beat soundly all year long that I can remember off the top of my head. Emory's been at the top of my ballot for much of the season now, and WashU was one of those teams we thought was going to be in the top five coming into the season. I feel like they didn't always play like it at the beginning of the year, lost that big game to Illinois Wesleyan that I already kind of hinted at. And then to start UAA play, they lost to Chicago, who's a good team. They're back in my ballot now, but it felt like WashU was supposed to be a tier above Chicago. But then they kind of turned the corner after that week. The Case Western Reserve Carnegie Mellon weekend for them a week ago. They just crushed both of those teams. They
Yeah,
took
big
care of
margins.
business. It's the teams they should beat in the UAA, even though they're good teams. Everyone's good in that conference. They just took care of business. They crushed them. Turn around this week with the tough at Rochester, at Emory grind. That's like basically 1,000 miles of travel between those two schools over the weekend. They take care of business at Rochester, winning by 17. Then they turn around, win at Emory by 18. That's big time stuff. And they're a team now that has a couple of good wins and really not a terrible bad loss, I don't think, on their resume. And that combines for a team that I'm really starting to trust in my poll. They're not going to make me look bad. They're not going to embarrass me, hopefully, and lose a bad game next week. But I think they're very deserving of kind of one of those upper echelon type rankings here.
Let's talk about number 6 here, Matt. Randolph-Macon. Once again, here we are, heading towards like the last month of play, and there they are, in a tie for first in the ODAC. Randolph-Macon is just inevitable.
Yeah, I think so. Every year, we talk about after their national championship, well, they lose a bunch of these guys and they're gonna fall off, but they were right back up there. Even up through last year, we thought they were gonna fall off, but they were right up there in the second weekend of the tournament again in the Sweet 16. A really tough game that they lost to Calvin. There's just basically a mismatch. They didn't really have anyone that could guard Jalen Overway, but they were a team that was right there with the top teams in the country last year. Here we are again. Late January, Randolph-Macon on my ballot, back up to number 6. That's just a solid program. That's a great coach, great coaching staff, great players that they get through there. So Randolph-Macon every year. I mean, eventually they're going to lose a few games, but they look good again. It's tough for me to really know exactly what the ODAC is this year. I don't think it's quite as strong last year, but you kind of look up and you're like, oh, I still have 3 or 4 ODACs in my top 25 every single year and 2 in the top 10 still.
All right, so let's talk about Emory, Matt, because obviously the weekend was disappointing for them. They lose at home to Chicago Friday, then they turn around and lose at home to WashU Sunday. Um, and like I said, I don't feel like they looked particularly good in doing so. But at the same time, that happens. Every team is capable of a range of performances. We've seen a lot on the other end of the spectrum for Emory, and it was just a weekend ago that they made the trip and got road wins at NYU and at Brandeis. So I feel like you had a really great trip, and then you have a not so great homestand. Maybe that's just what happens when you are in the UAA. It's kind of we we talk about up down theory with NFL performances, and maybe that's just the way it goes when you're playing tough competition every night in the UAA. Those things are going to happen. Um, you knock them down to number 7 here. I wouldn't be surprised if we have other voters that maybe
Yeah.
punish them a little bit harder. But like I said, you juxtapose the last two weekends they have, and maybe you don't want to overreact, but at the same time, that most recent weekend we saw was a bit concerning, considering they had those games at home.
Yeah, and I'm obviously still a big believer in Emory, voting them at number 7. I think you're absolutely correct. You could drop them out of the top 10 after this last week. So I'm gonna say what I'm gonna say, but caveat it with I'm a believer in Emory, right at number 7. You could make a pretty good case though that Emory has now lost a bunch of their most difficult games, like almost all of their most difficult games. They started the year looking really strong. They had an early win against Guilford. They went to GLI where they beat Calvin and John Carroll. And we thought, like, Emory's great. John Carroll ends up maybe not quite the team we thought they were going into the season. They have a big injury, so they're at number 18. Calvin was a team with that tough schedule that lost a bunch of games early, so they're only now popping back into my top 25 at number 25. So still very good wins there. They were impressive in that weekend, but maybe not quite the wins maybe we thought they might be back in November. They've beaten Bowdoin and Middlebury, two NESCAC teams, good programs from good conferences, but maybe Middlebury is not quite as good as they looked back in maybe early December. Then you go into UAA play. They had that big win against NYU. That's definitely, they deserve credit for that one. That is a very good win. Actually, just prior to that, they had lost against Christopher Newport. So that's another difficult game that I believe Emory had lost. They got that good win against NYU, which is good, but now they turn around and have this weekend of Chicago and Wash U, and they lose both of those. So you could construct this argument, whereas Emory has only won like maybe 1 out of 4 or 5 of their top games. Their better wins maybe don't quite look as good as they did at the time, and maybe Emory for a while by people like me maybe had been overvalued up at like number 1 or number 2, and maybe they are more of a mid-poll type of a team, and a team that's maybe gonna lose to the teams right at the top.
And having dropped those home games to Chicago and Wash U in terms of UAA race, you're looking at a situation where they probably need to make that road trip and get those road wins, having, you know, I don't want to say it's not going to be the right way to say it, but having given away the opportunity to get those home wins, right? Credit Wash U, credit Chicago. They went and they got the road games. Now Emory essentially has to go do the same to
Yeah,
get
to keep
back on even
pace.
footing with those two. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, Wisconsin Lutheran at 8, Matt. This was an interesting one. We talked a little bit about this last Thursday on our live show in our top 25 panel discussion. They feel like a team that maybe just because of the schedule and the conference they're in has a little bit of a ceiling on their ranking, right? They're getting into conference play and don't have the same opportunity to rank or to rack up a win, certainly against like UAA opponents, or like Illinois Wesleyan will be playing a different tier of teams in the CCIW,
Yeah.
and Randolph Macon in the ODAC. So, yeah, I don't know. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more? Wisconsin Lutheran at 8. It kind of feels like, just in terms of the opportunity they have to show what they're capable of, they're kind of capped out.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I try my hardest when I'm doing my top 25 ballot to not just make it a resume ranking, right? So it's just who did you beat or who did you lose to. We talk a lot about it in those contexts because I think it's easy to have a discussion this way, but that's not strictly what I'm doing when I'm building my ballot. I try to look at it and say, I think on a neutral court, generally team 1 will beat team 2, will beat team 3, will beat team 4. And my opinion on that matter changes every week as we see different games. So yes, to some degree, Wisconsin Lutheran playing in the Northern Athletics Conference isn't going to have a lot of opportunity, isn't going to have any opportunities from here on out to go in and show, yeah, we can beat a Randolph Macon or a Platteville or a Wash U or an Illinois Wesleyan. So to some degree, they might be capped from rising greatly. Other people might have good wins to show me that, yes, they could beat a team like that. On the other hand, if they don't lose games and they're beating these teams soundly, I think they can stay. But that's why I'm relying a little bit of some of the games they did in the non-conference. Right, not the best CCIWs. They did beat Elmhurst, North Park, and Wheaton. That's 3 CCIWs that they played in November. They tried to take the opportunity to play some of those programs, and they beat them. North Park is actually having a great year now, and they beat them soundly. So I think that does say a little bit. But yeah, I try not to say like, well, Wisconsin Lutheran, maybe didn't beat anyone like Illinois Wesleyan did. Given that they're maybe still executing against their schedule the way they should, the way I think they could as a number 8 team, I can kind of keep them there. I think, yes, they'll probably be more limited as far as the upward mobility than some other teams might be. But I try to at least say, like, despite who they've played, been able to beat or had to lose to, do I think they could beat a Hampton-Sydney? And right now, I think yes. So I'm going to rank them above, not just because of trying to compare the two resumes side by side, or that feeds me information, but because I think that they would win a game, or they might be favored to win a game.
All right, we've talked a lot about the UAA. Matt, NYU is sitting there. I think we're going to learn a lot about NYU as we're talking next week. They'll have their road trip coming up at Chicago, at Wash U. Um, off to a UAA start with wins over Brandeis, Rochester, at Carnegie Mellon, and at Case Western Reserve. Of course, the home loss to Emory. Um, it feels like NYU's sort of taking care of business as they've needed to so far in UAA, but like I said, taking that trip to Chicago and Wash U, I think will probably tell us a lot more about NYU than we really know at this point.
Yeah, that'll be a big game for them because they're going to want to be in that UAA race. So taking a road trip like that's going to be a big one for them. And this weekend, you're right. I think it was kind of a taking care of business a week for them on the road against Carnegie Mellon, Case Western Reserve. The scoring margins were a little bit closer than I would like to see for a top 10 team against those two. But it's UAA, it's on the road, so it's kind of like, okay, we'll move on. I think around number 9 is the right range for NYU, so I'm good with that.
Yep. We've seen a lot of teams, drop that Sunday game. No matter who the opponent is. So, Case has kind of struggled this year, but getting that Sunday road UAA win is all you need as you're getting back on the plane. All right, Hampton Sydney is the second ODAC team on the list here, Matt. I feel like Hampton Sydney's been a little bit interesting this year. They really, heading into the season, not really sure what to make of them, and then it's like, oh yeah, Hampton Sydney's just fine. Maybe a little bit lower on the radar over the last month or so. I don't know. Maybe that's not quite fair. But Hampton Sydney rounds out your top 10 this week.
Yeah, mostly have just gone on and take care of business. They've beaten Randolph Macon twice, even though now I have Randolph Macon 4 spots ahead. Losses to John Carroll, not a terrible loss. They repaid the favor from last year. They do have a loss to Guilford, which you don't love, but again, those types of losses will happen in ODAC play. And then they lost to someone back in November. Oh, that was the Gettysburg loss by
Gettysburg.
3. And again, Gettysburg is fine, good team, a team you would like to see Hampton Sydney win, but those are the 3 losses on the season against a schedule that does include those 2 Randolph Macon wins, Christopher Newport win. I think Hampton Sydney is still good. They usually do find a way to get things done. I think they have the right veterans on that team, the right team leadership on that team, where they can maybe win those games. Things get tight at the end. I think they're a team that maybe you do trust with some players that you do trust to execute down the stretch. And I think for the most part, they've done that.
hmm Matt, UW Lacrosse has gotten into WIAC play. Looks solid. They did drop a game to Platteville, but it looks like they're every bit of their 11th ranking here. St. John's has been really good ever since a tournament over a month ago now. The last 5 weeks, it feels like St. John's has really turned it on offensively, basically head and shoulders above the MIAC. It'll be interesting to see. They've got one game against Gustavus Adolphus. Outside of Gustavus, not sure who's going to challenge St. John's, if anyone. A couple of NESCAC teams here, Matt. Trinity and Tufts. I think you were messaging me a little bit, some hypotheticals as you were putting your poll together. Talk about the decision making process and trying to figure out Trinity coming off that loss against Wesleyan versus Tufts, who also looks like a NESCAC contender.
Yeah, I was just trying to compare their overall resumes and put them together. I think they're pretty close for me. Obviously, I put them back to back. We have not seen them play each other, and I don't think we've also seen Tufts play Wesleyan. So, a couple more interesting NESCAC games that we still have ahead of us as far as maybe deciding who could stay in the conference race. Both these teams need those games largely to get into it. Tufts, with both of those still to play, maybe controls their own destiny a little bit more. But I would like to see that. I think. Both teams have, I think, shown themselves to be in that upper echelon of that conference. Tufts really hasn't, like, their only kind of like head scratching game was maybe that Nichols lost. Nichols has been a really good program for several years. They're not the team this year that they were maybe the last 2 years, but still that's a program you don't, quote, mind losing to. Although I don't think Nichols is the same. And then they have a loss to WPI, but that's, WPI is still pretty good. So I think a lot of teams that we've been talking about in this top 25 have a loss like at a WPI. So really interested in seeing those types of games from Tufts. I honestly haven't been quite sure what to make of them. Sticking here in the teens, that's my way of saying, like, I'm not really sure that they're a top 10 team. They might prove to be. I think I wouldn't surprise me if Tufts is like the number 9, 8 team in the country or something like that. I'm just not quite sure yet.
Well, and they're another team that's got a big week here coming up, Matt, at Wesleyan and at Trinity.
Yeah. Okay.
It
So it's the
feels
big week.
like
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it feels like, maybe if they lose both of those games, maybe they're towards the back part of the top 25 or even maybe taking a week out. They go 2-0, they're gonna rocket up this list. They go 1-1, they might just kinda hang out in about the spot where they are right now, right?
Yeah, right. So that's the well, we're going to learn a whole lot about Tufts scenario, but then maybe they beat one, they lose to one. Like if they beat Trinity and lose to Wesleyan, then what, you move them up like a spot or two or something like
Right.
that, and it's kind of like okay, well they're the same.
And Christopher Newport, you talked about the win they have, on the resume against Emory, one of those coast to coast conference teams. It's a little bit hard to follow them sometimes this time of year because they play their, you know, conference, non-conference schedule while everyone else is playing real conference games. Typically, their schedule is much more front loaded, so feels like in terms of games played, they have a little bit more water under the bridge than some other people. Matt, let's go on to Denison. They've really, Worcester is definitely seems to be impacted now by injuries, and then Denison has been right there at the top of the NCACs to give them to give that conference, a team right here in the middle of the top 25 mix, even with Worcester starting to struggle a little bit more after they initially seemed to be able to weather the storm with the injury situation there.
Yeah, and a neutral court overtime loss to UC Santa Cruz is the only thing that's really kind of head scratching me for me about Denison right now. But that's like a month and a half ago, and they've put some together some good wins since then. So they're definitely the Big Red climbing up my ballot. Looks good. Looks like they're in charge of the NCAC. It looks like if someone's gonna challenge for that, they're gonna have to go through Denison. So yeah, they've looked strong.
hmm And Virginia Wesleyan, Matt, there's been a tier of ODAC teams that's been really hard to figure out. It seems like Virginia Wesleyan is kind of emerging as the leader of that tier at this point. We've seen, Roanoke in and out of, your top 25 ballot. They once again took another loss to a top team here this past week against Randolph Macon, I believe at home. Um, Virginia Wesleyan sitting there at a tie for the ODAC lead at the moment.
Yeah, and I think their three losses on the season are an overtime loss to Christopher Newport, not bad. They lost by 3 to Salisbury, and then they lost to Roanoke. That's what we've seen out of their schedule. I think that they're going to have to play a few of their more difficult ODACs ahead. Um, they beat Guilford by 19. I think Guilford's a good team, so I think that's a good win. I think they're still a team we're going to learn a lot about in this last kind of month of the season or so than we know right now. They're a team, honestly, if you look at my whole ballot and say which team am I nervous about being too high, it's probably Virginia Wesleyan up there at 17. It feels like that's a little bit aspirational for them, maybe, but at 14-3 with a pretty good schedule in the ODAC with some good wins in there, I think they are a good team.
To John Carroll a little bit. This has got to be a tough situation for a voter. Highly ranked team coming into the season. They suffered an injury to their All-American point guard Luke Chacon. They had a had a period there immediately following where they struggled, including having to turn around the very next day after that injury occurred, having to play Emory. Emory got that win. Um, John Carroll had a little bit of a rough stretch there trying to figure it out, but it seems like they have figured it out. You mentioned they've got a win at Hampton Sydney, and they're right back there in the mix of the OAC race. They've definitely had to earn their way back in, but they have done that. Matt, how do you evaluate a team like that? Obviously, is a good team and was not just a one player team, but was so highly ranked. That's a tough thing to have to adjust to mid season. So when you're taking losses, you have to adjust, how you're evaluating a team. But then they're, making their way back up here.
Yeah, I think that's 10 wins in a row. And the injury to Chacon happened during a game against Johns Hopkins, who I think is like a top 50 team, let's say. Then they had to turn around the next night and play Emory, who's obviously in my top 10 here. Then their first conference game out of that stretch, or the next game after Emory was their first conference game against Mount Union. That's one of the more difficult teams in their league. They lost that. And then they, right after, lost the game to Ohio Northern by 1. And Ohio Northern is a kind of a resurgent OAC program this year. After that, so that was 4 losses in a row, kind of during and after the injury to Luke Chacon. They've won 10 in a row now, including a win at Hampton Sydney. So they've taken care of business against the OAC teams on their schedule, including this week at Ohio Northern, one of the teams that had beaten them. So really, if you look, they kind of won all their games that they were supposed to before the injury. they had that 4 game stretch where they were figuring it out against tough teams, and then now have won 10 in a row. So to me, it's definitely a team that is back on track, taking care of business. Back, I don't know if they're necessarily in charge of the OAC since they have a loss to Mount Union already on the books, but they are as in charge of the OAC as maybe anyone in what is always kind of a strong, deep league. So I definitely want to see what they will look like, maybe against like a Marietta on the road and Mount Union on the road in the future. I think that's coming up ahead in the next week or two. But yeah, John Carroll's starting to look like the team we thought they could be.
And then the top of the Skyac looks like a take your pick from week to week. Cal Lu leads the standings and checks in at number 19. Matt, also number 24, Redlands. Claremont Mudscript's very much in that mix in the Skyac. It feels like, we've talked about it looking at previous ballots. There's just a group of a few teams there that are rotating around, this kind of 19 to 25 to just off the board area of your ballot.
Yeah, Cal Lutheran had a really nice week this week. Let me scroll over to my notes. I think it was 3 wins. They beat Chapman, who's another team that's been kind of in the top half of that league, and then they won a really entertaining game, a game that I actually watched 3 quarters of. The ending was great, but I finally had to go to bed and I had to kind of catch up on the highlights the next day. But at Claremont Mudscripts, they won by 2 in a game that CMS kind of won early. Then through kind of the middle phase of the game, Cal Lu took control and then got really tight at the end. So that was a really entertaining Skyac game. Then they also capped it off with a win at Whittier. So 3 big wins for Cal Lu. I think this is something we've mentioned with this conference, the Southern California League, all season long, but a bunch of teams in the mix. Right now, I'm trusting Cal Lutheran the most in that conference as far as teams that can come away and when things get tight, maybe pull out that big win.
All right, Chicago, fresh off the big weekend, Matt, number 20. Maybe a team that's got some upward mobility, depending on whether they can keep that going.
Yeah, the big overtime win Friday night. We've already talked about their win over Emory. That was a big thing. Traveling to Rochester this past weekend, that's a tough stretch. They got the 3-point win. You don't want to see only a 3-point win against Rochester, but you can't knock them for beating Emory in overtime 2 days before, doing that long travel, and then going back and still getting the W. So not really
Sunday
holding that.
road game in the UAA, just get the W.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just get the W, and Chicago did, and yeah, I mean, they control what they want to control going forward if they can keep getting
Mhm.
wins.
All right, Matt, Keene State, another one of those programs, maybe a little bit like Wisconsin Lutheran. They've obviously got the track record, but it's like once they get into Little East play, you feel like there's not as much that you can learn from them, at least in terms of the types of opponents that they're beating. Of course, there's still evaluation you can do based on how they're performing against that and the margins and whatnot, but um, you know, maybe not as much to be gained or lost from that schedule in the Little East. All right, WPI, Matt, the new Mac. A lot of yo-yoing going on in the new Mac. WPI feels like they've been the most consistent, and I think that's what's kind of keeping them in your top 25 ballot.
Yeah, exactly. And a huge win against MIT. That was by almost 40 points this week. A very solid win against Wheaton Mass. And then a kind of a close one against Salve Regina, but they still got the 3-win week there. WPI at 16-2. I think, that race is still pretty close there in the new MAC. But for me, they're on top of it. And I think they're the pick. I think they're the one going forward. And they're the one that makes the ballot here.
And St. Thomas, Matt, you think they're the best team in Texas right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it is probably pretty close between them and maybe like a Mary Hardin Baylor. St. Thomas, Texas does kind of make me nervous. Some of the games you kind of either watch or keep track of the score, and midway through it's really tight. Maybe they find a way to pull away and win. You look at their resume and you just like it's not a ton of great wins there. The teams that they've played, they haven't really played a lot of upper echelon talent. I think they're good. It's a little bit difficult to tell how good. At 16-1, most teams that are 16-1 or better are higher on my ballot than this. Um, and they were a team that some people questioned in our live stream about like why are people voting for St. Thomas, Texas, and I get that. But for me at 23, I think that they're there. I think maybe they are the best team in Texas, but maybe between like a Mary Hardin Baylor or like a Trinity, that there's even not too much separation between those 3 teams. Maybe.
Yep. And we've talked about Redlands, and Matt Calvin gets back into your ballot here. Have they survived the brutal stretch to the start of the season, starting what 0-6? They're on a 10-game winning streak now. Of course, getting into conference play, the level of competition went down significantly from non-conference play. but getting a road win at Hope was good, and of course, as Calvin fans, we love to see that. But then that's also, just a data point that the winning streak is not just about the level of competition. It is a team that is playing much better than they were earlier in the season when they were taking a bunch of losses to some really good teams. But look, a couple of those non-conference wins that they do have, Lacrosse and St. John's, are looking
Yeah.
just as good now as they probably did at that time.
Yeah, they got those wins in there. Bunch of just wins in a row, beating some of these MIAA teams by 20 and 30 points. That 24-point win against Alma, I'm honestly, they didn't always play great during that stretch, but good enough to win by 24. We talked about that brutal stretch to start the season. This is their mini brutal stretch right here. They had at Hope on Wednesday, then they got the Alma game. They'll be at Trine this upcoming Wednesday, then home versus Hope on Saturday. So in a 4-game stretch, they're going to be at Hope, at Trine, home versus Hope. So that's kind of be their mini brutal stretch in conference play. So if they can weather this storm, they got the one big win at Hope already. That's the rivalry win too. So there's a lot of emotions charged in that game. But for me right now, right at the end of the ballot, are they in? Are they out? That cut line's right around Calvin, and for me, they were just in.
So that's a lot of time spent on just your top 25 ballot, Matt. But of course, there are a lot more than just 25 teams worth diving deep into. So, as a special feature for this episode, we're going from the top 25, Matt, to your next 25. Let's talk about the next 25 who didn't make your ballot, but they are that next 25 group that have your eye, that you're looking closely at on a weekly basis, contenders for that top 25 ballot every week.
Yeah, this so on the screen now is an alphabetical list of teams. Basically approximately my next 25 teams on my watch list. Right, I didn't. This is not like a ballot I would submit, so I didn't comb through it for hours to make sure every team's perfect. There might have been a team here or there that you trade in or out of this list, but this is maybe approximately the next 25. I'll read them quickly for the audio only people. That's Anderson, Babson, Brandeis, Carthage, Catholic, Claremont Mudscripts, Drew, Guilford, Gustavus Adolphus, Hamilton, Johns Hopkins, Mary Hardin Baylor, Mount Union, Nebraska Wesleyan, Roanoke, Stevens, Stockton, TCNJ, Trinity, Texas, UW Eau Claire, UW Oshkosh, UW Stevens Point, Wabash, Whitworth, and Worcester.
And Matt, I know that there are a bunch of these teams that you have voted for at various points throughout the season. I believe there are a few that you have not. Just the first one off the list that are a couple that I don't believe you have voted for at any point this season would include Carthage, Gustavus Adolphus.
Brandeis, I don't think I
Um,
voted for.
okay, Brandeis, Nebraska Wesleyan, unless they were in your preseason. I don't think they were they?
I don't think I voted. Oh, yeah, I think they maybe were in my preseason. I can probably
Okay.
look all this up if we wanted to do it on the fly.
All right, but it's a good mix of teams that you haven't voted for at all, have voted for at various times. Um, would you give any sort of broad characterization to this next 25 group, or is it just as in flux as a top 25 ballot is from week to week?
It's definitely in flux. It might even be more in flux week to week
Hmm.
because one really good win makes a difference here. I was trying to see if there's like one uniting theme between all of these teams. There's not really, but there's a couple of different types of teams on here. There's a right at the top, right? Anderson. They're a team that really has very few really good wins. Like Carthage is one of their best wins, also on this list. That's a good win. But they also don't really have many bad losses. They do have a loss to Rose Holman, which is kind of like a 100-ish team. If you think of like Massey ratings number 100, I think that's around where Rose Holman is. That's like one of their worst losses. But that's kind of their resume, is a bunch of those wins kind of in that range. But then you have a team like Babson. They've beaten Trinity, Connecticut. They've beaten WPI. They've beaten Worcester. But then they've also lost to Mass Dartmouth and Wheaton, Massachusetts, and Emerson, teams that are more maybe closer to number 200 overall. So I think those are two like different types of resumes. Babson has almost shown that they can beat anyone, but they're also going to lose to a bunch of teams. Whereas Anderson has maybe played teams in a tighter range. No real wins are going to excite you too much, but there's not really a loss that stands out there that disqualifies you. And almost any of these teams, if someone wanted to submit one of these teams from 20 to 25 on their ballot, you can kind of construct a case for almost any one of them.
And then are there any on this list that you're particularly excited about, but you're just waiting for a certain result to really pull the trigger, but you feel like you want to, but you just can't quite yet?
I mean, a team like Gustavus Adolphus maybe fits that bill. I think we talked about them a little bit on the live stream with someone brought them up. Maybe it was Ryan Whitnable, if I remember correctly. Really would like to see them play like a St. John's in the MIAC. I think they only have one game against St. John's this year. I think it's maybe toward the end of the season. So for a person like me, maybe I wouldn't learn a whole ton about Gustavus Adolphus until the end of the year. But that's going to be a really good game. There's a team like Carthage. I think that has been right on the cusp for me a lot of times. Just hasn't really been put over the edge. They have a really good win. I think it was on the road at Illinois Wesleyan. That on its own is almost good enough to get you into the top 25. And they've been under consideration for a long time for me. They've been taking care of business in the CCIW for the most part, and they look really strong. So they're definitely a team that could work their way in based on results in the conference in the second half of conference play.
And then would Drew be another one of those teams? I think they're a team that I feel like is right there. I'm a little bit surprised. They haven't been able to slide in for you yet, but seem to be like right there. The losses to TCNJ at Farmingdale State at NYU, 14-3 overall
Yeah, one of those you said Farmingdale State, right?
for Drew. Yeah,
Yeah, so that's like
yep.
a little bit of like a well, that's one of the reasons why they haven't been there. But they do have an overtime win against Catholic. I think they're currently on top of the landmark standings. I think we're getting daily updates from Bob
Yes.
Quillman about Drew's position because he has them in our conference champions draft episode. For me, they're just a little bit short on those like top notch wins. So when I'm looking at like computer ratings and who you've played and what your schedule is. It's just hard for me to go out and say I think Drew would definitely beat anyone on my top 25 board. Maybe a little bit like Anderson, where the best win is against Catholic, who's a team that's kind of also on this list. So it's not really like they have a differentiating feature. Um, Whereas like okay, Calvin made 25 on my list. They've beaten St. John's, they've beaten UW La Crosse. Yeah, they have some other losses mixed in there against good teams, but they've at least shown a couple times that they can compete at the top 25 level and win those games.
And it strikes me that there's a few teams on this list where they do have some really solid wins, but they're offset to the negative against with not just losses, but losses against teams that you wouldn't want to see from a top 25 team. I'm thinking about teams like Mary Hardin Baylor and Whitworth, teams that you have voted for in the past.
Yeah.
Whitworth has a win against Cal Lu. Mary Hardin Baylor has beaten Illinois Wesleyan, but they've both have some losses that you just don't really want to see out of a top 25 team when you're considering other teams that have lost to, um, have better losses than some of them that those two teams do.
Yeah, and Mary Hardin Baylor, I think, is so emblematic of that. That win against Illinois Wesleyan was huge. They've beaten St. Thomas, Texas, a team that I talked about at the end of my ballot at number 23 there. This week, though, they lost to ETBU. And ETBU is only like a kind of like a Massey number 200 type team. So it's just, you don't know as a voter which Mary Hardin Baylor are you going to get to show up on any given night. I think we've seen that several years. We've seen them even in like conference tournaments and tournaments feels like sometimes they show up as strong as anyone and then turn around the next night and just like don't come to the gym. Maybe it's saying it too harshly, but they're definitely a team. Talking about UMHB here that can beat anyone and then they might lose to anyone. So you just don't know who's going to show up on any given night.
Yeah, and Matt, offline, we were talking about taking a look at the Stevens resume, right? Another one, they have a 14-3 record. The record overall looks good. And then you look at the loss, loss to Middlebury, loss to Hamilton, and then it's like, okay, it's a 14-3 record, but you start looking at who they played, who they've beaten, and with those two, you figure, okay, if you pluck them and stuck them in the NESCAC, would you expect them
Yeah.
to be like in the top 5 or 6 of the NESCAC? And you look at those results and you're like, well, maybe not. So if you're talking about top 25 voting, you got to basically put them behind, those group of teams that you have in, and then like Hamilton's on this list. And that's one of the teams they lost to, and another one of those teams kind of in that NESCAC range that
Yeah.
you kind of try to figure how, how would they match up with a team like Hamilton in that range. I know they have the head to head with Hamilton, but some of
Yeah.
those other teams, how would they match up?
Right, and I just pulled up as we're talking about this. What does the Stevens Massey schedule look like? They've only played 3 teams in the top 100. They've lost all those, and you already mentioned a Hamilton loss and a Middlebury loss, both by double digits. So that's like, okay, well, we haven't beaten anyone in the top 100. Stevens is a team that my computer system likes quite a bit, but I think it's largely because they've beaten teams between, let's say, like number 100 and number 200, and they often beat them soundly. Like they have a win over DeSales by 40 points. So the computer's like, well, DeSales is just kind of like, you know, 66th percentile team. So like a good team, but not upper echelon at all. And you beat them by 40, so you must be really good. And it feels like they've done that a few times. But then when they've played the really good teams on their schedule, they haven't gotten the wins. Yeah, the Catholic loss was only by 2, so that's fine. The computer would look at that and say, you're pretty close to as good as Catholic based on that result. But again, a human voter is going to look at that and say, well, I'm gonna ding you because you have losses. It was close. Okay, so I'm willing to say it was close. Give you some points for that. But then you also lost to Hamilton by 11. You also lost to Middlebury by 11, I think it was. And then your best win is against Oswego State, who's a big name, but at this point they're not having quite the season that they've had the last couple of years, and they're more of like a number 100-ish team than like a really good team.
Hmm. And let's talk about the NJAC here. You got a couple on the list here with Stockton and TCNJ. But it's a conference that it's hard to make heads or tails of. You got Stockton and TCNJ on this list here, and you're like, yeah, I feel like these are teams that I like. And you look at the NJAC standings, and they've got Ramapo, Montclair State, and Stockton at 8-3. TCNJ, Rowan, and Kane are all 7-4. How do you make sense of that? I mean, it's like, okay, I think I like these teams, but I don't know that I can really separate them from a group of six here in at the top of the NJAC. It's a wild situation. It's going to be a great race to watch down the stretch, and the NJAC seems like they're always in for a wild conference tournament. Another great one to watch, I think, during that championship week.
Yeah, that's the difficult thing about that conference is a bunch of good teams. Teams I'm no longer confident are all in the top 25, but like a bunch of teams that you want to put in that kind of next 25 range. But you're right, I didn't have Montclair State in this list. I didn't have Ramapo in this list. I didn't even have Rowan in this list right now. But those are all teams that are kind of in this range still. And as you said, like that's just going to make it for a heck of a conference tournament. I know last year that was I think that became my favorite conference tournament to watch, like one that I wasn't personally invested in because I knew I could turn on like a weeknight, whatever it was, like NJAC quarterfinals or something, and there's just going to be an entertaining as heck game against kind of two of these teams in this range, and that's going to be this year again.
All right, that's fun. Fun to take an expanded view. Always fun to check out your ballot from week to week, but always but a great here this week to zoom out a bit and not only get the top 25, but a look at a next 25 and be able to talk about some more teams beyond the 25 that are getting your vote that week.
And one funny thing, as I put this list together, in many years, you could almost take this snapshot and say like, "Hey, this was the alphabetical list of the top 25 in week 11 or whatever," and people would look at the names and you'd kind of say like, "Oh yeah, that probably was like a random year's top 25 names like Carthage, like Claremont Mudscripts, like Guilford, like Johns Hopkins, Mary Hardin Baylor, like these are all teams that we've seen in the top 25 in recent years, teams that have won national championships, UW Oshkosh, UW Stevens Point." So I think it's just goes to show that Division 3 quality actually does run pretty deep as far as these top-notch programs. Just because you're not in the top 25, like these are a bunch of really good teams, really good programs that I'm calling as like these next 25. But in any given year, these are teams we expect and do often see right in that top 25 list.
Yeah, a lot of teams on the second list that probably the teams on the first list may not like to see
Oh yeah.
should they be matched up in the NCAA tournament. All right, Matt, which brings us to our next topic of the week.
All right. So one thing that is new this year is that the top 8 will be protected in the NCAA tournament. So we just talked about the top 25, the next 25. They're all chasing a top 8 spot in the NPI rankings, the new NCAA tournament selection metric. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what that's going to look like to protect the top 8 seeds. If you followed other sports, you saw that a little bit because they have similar bracketing principles as well. But what that means is that the top 8 in the NPI are going to be bracketed so that they don't meet before the quarterfinals. So no matter what happens with geography, We know Division 3 likes to group teams within 500 miles because then they will pay to bus a team rather than to fly a team, and it's a lot more expensive to fly a team. But no matter what happens with the geography, it could be the 8 WIAC teams, 1 through 8 in the NPI, they would all be protected in this way. And that means they're separated. The ones go on the one line, the twos go on the two line. They cannot meet until the national quarterfinal. But we should be careful to clarify what this protection means. It's bracketing balancing the bracket based on seeding, not giving you the right to host necessarily. So we're protecting your seeding, giving you the right matchups against the right quality teams, not saying that you're protected and get to stay at home and get to host a first round pod or even a sectional round. That's what's being prioritized here is the seeding. So we're going to hopefully not as frequently maybe have a bracket of death where all the good teams have to go in one region because well, they were all in Wisconsin and Illinois or wherever, or they were all in Virginia, and so they have to go together because geographically they have to. If you're really in the top 8 in the NPI, we'll spread you out to make sure that those teams at least don't meet until the quarterfinals. So I ran NPI. I got most of the games, as many as I could, like all the UAA and some of those SCAC games like St. Thomas and Trinity, Texas. So I made sure to include those Sunday games, and I ran an NPI in the background. And here's where the top 8 stood as of kind of Sunday evening this week. Wesleyan was number 1. UW Platteville was number 2. Illinois Wesleyan was number 3. NYU was number 4. So we know with the new bracketing principles, those 4 teams will be the top teams in each quadrant. If you think of 4 quadrants in a bracket, they'll be on the top line. Then paired with each one of those will be kind of like a number 2 seed. If you think of a Division 1 type bracket, UW La Crosse will be one of those. Emory will be one of those. Wash U will be one of those, and Tufts would be one of those, using through Sunday's NPI. So then what the committee is going to do is take those kind of number 2s, those second 4 in the top 8, and pair them geographically with a number 1, such that if it all works out, you could maybe start to make a second weekend sectional pod geographically. Zach, do you have any comments on that, or should we go and start looking at what this might look like?
No, I think that's good because it's been a real discussion point in recent years. I know it came up, I think, both on the men's side and women's side. Last year, there were some pretty high profile examples of people upset because certain programs were not hosting, certain top seeded teams were not
Yeah.
hosting, and that's not really what this is going to change. Like you said, it's about separating top teams in the bracket. We saw this play out in men's soccer in the fall, where I believe it was either 5 or 6 of the top 8 were NESCAC schools, right? And so they were all spread out in the bracket, where geographically maybe you would have had to clump them a little bit more than they were, but such that if you took the highest seeded teams and pushed them through the bracket, they wouldn't have met up until the quarterfinals, right? Until that final 8. So that's really what has been prioritized. So we could still see a situation where, maybe Case Western Reserve last year was the top remaining seed, but they had to go play up a sectional at Trine because you could Platteville could get to Trine, Case could get to Trine, so that was the host. So this does not change necessarily that situation. And I there may be some people that are disappointed to hear that, but that decision making was made through through feedback from membership. It was determined that overall the priority was on uh, bracket balance and spreading out some teams, even if that happened at the expense of being able to host. Right, so it was about protecting that path through the bracket in terms of seeding rather than in terms of location. Um, yeah, so I think that's just the thing to understand is what that means versus what it doesn't mean, and the process that led to that decision. This wasn't necessarily some sort of edict. There was a lot of feedback that was solicited in terms of overall championship experience enhancements, and out as a result of that feedback, this is what was determined, and this has been adopted as a pilot program that will play out over the next 2 seasons. This is the first time we're really working under these bracketing principles, and they will extend into next year, and then I guess depending on how successful or additional feedback after that time will be determined whether or not changes are made, or this kind of stays the law of the land. But I know there are geographic restrictions, and this is one of the things that has been added as a championship experience enhancement that supersedes geography. When a lot of times we've seen geography be the
Yeah.
thing that supersedes a lot of other factors.
Right. And if you have to prioritize one, like because finances are limited, do we prioritize the ability to host rounds of games, or do we prioritize the path, the seeding, the matchups? And it was determined we're going to prioritize the matchups, and it might sacrifice hosting a little bit. All right, so let's take a look at what this could look like on a bracket when the committees start to put teams on or pair them up to build a bracket. What might this look like? Um, First things first, at the top of the bracket, you get your number ones. So Wesleyan was the number one overall seed, so maybe they go in the upper left. And then UW Platteville was the number two, so they go on a number one seed line, but then you try to bracket it so they wouldn't meet Wesleyan until the national championship game, if possible. And then NYU was the number four, so maybe you pair them up with Wesleyan, the number one, so that would be a national semifinal. And then Illinois Wesleyan was the number three, so maybe you pair them up with UW Platteville as a potential national semifinal. So now you have the number ones all across the bracket on a one seed line. Then you go down and you look at the bottom of the bracket and take 5 through 8 and try to pair them up geographically such that you would have reasonable routes to build a 500-mile sectional round, sectional weekend bracket if you could. So you pair up. I think the number 5 team, if I scroll back a little bit, was UW La Crosse. So maybe pair them up with Illinois Wesleyan. Then pair up. You're left with Tufts, Emory, and Wash U to pair with UW Platteville. The only one there that goes well with UW Platteville is Wash U, so you put them there. Emory is going to be on an island on their own, and then Tufts is remaining. Tufts could be paired with either Wesleyan or NYU in kind of a 500-mile sense. So since they're the number 8 seed, we opted for this graphic here to pair them up with the number 1 seed because that would be the most true seeding sense. So then you'd be left with maybe a quadrant built around Wesleyan and Tufts, a quadrant with NYU and Emory, a quadrant with UW Platteville with Wash U, and then a quadrant with Illinois Wesleyan and UW La Crosse. So this would be your kind of your basis, and then you'd go through the rest of the remaining what would it be 56 teams, and you put them into pods and then into quadrants to try to fairly balance the bracket out the rest of the way.
And it works here that you can get a 1 versus 8, a 2 and 7 pairing, but that's not guaranteed to happen. It just so happens that in the example here, except for NYU Emory, you get the seating and the geography to line
Yeah.
up such that they could line up those number 1 and number 2 seeds. But that's not guaranteed to happen. We do know that the quadrants would be set up based on the 1 through 4, but do not expect, unless the geography happens to line up, that it would be 1 and 8 paired together, 2 and 7
Yeah.
paired together, 3 and 6, and then 4 and 5.
Yeah.
I think that would be the the preference, the priority as they're building the bracket. But like I said, geography will come into play in terms of how that ultimately plays out.
And you said it, Zach, but it's worth saying again. It kind of happens to work out geographically based on these 8 teams. But let's say it was Wisconsin Lutheran and not Tufts that got that 8th spot. Then you would see a bracket that has Wesleyan and maybe it's Wisconsin Lutheran or one of those other teams like Wash U or UW La Crosse. They'd be paired up with Wesleyan in that quadrant. So we know at some point in that group of 16 teams, we're going to have a flight maybe in the second weekend to get a team somewhere. So, but rather than what they might have done in the past, is just bump Wisconsin Lutheran, who should have been kind of on a mythical hypothetical 2 line to a 3 line and pair them over with maybe UW La Crosse. They're saying no, we're gonna, even though geographically it's not convenient, we're gonna have to pay for a flight somewhere. We're putting Wisconsin Lutheran where they deserve. We're gonna pair them up with Wesleyan, let's say, and we're gonna have to deal with that in the second weekend. So here it kind of worked out conveniently that maybe the committee would have something good to go on. But you actually, even though we paired them this way, we don't know that we could construct a full bracket with the teams in this order until we actually went through the process. What you might find is you'd actually have to pair Wash U, let's say, with Illinois Wesleyan and put UW La Crosse in the Platteville pod because maybe you need more Ohio teams to kind of fill in, and you can't stretch maybe second weekend geography as well with the UW La Crosse and UW Platteville in two different quadrants. So you'd have to get to a point where you filled in the bracket enough and know, oh, we have to start shifting some of these things around. And you might take that whole Wash U pod and flip it with the UW La Crosse pod. But you kind of can't tell that until you get a long way into your bracketing exactly how creative you're going to be with the geography.
So hopefully that helps, Matt. I think there's been some confusion or just not a lot of messaging about what that will mean for the top 8 seeds. So a lot to look for as NPI plays out. Of course, NPI will be how the at-large bids are selected. So a lot of focus on that Pool C cut line, but also a battle there for the top 8 will be very interesting to see play out.
Yeah. And we don't know. I mean, in the past, it's been pretty traditional. We expect, for the most part, if you are, we kind of grade out like those 3 and those 4 seed lines, which would be top 16 teams. In the past, we've thought about those as teams in line to host. And then I think that will be largely true. But I think in these new current bracketing principles, that's not guaranteed either. If kind of seeding and geography works out to put a 3 seed on the road and put maybe a number 11 seed at home just because we can bracket teams and be more creative with our bracket there. I think that's going to happen from time to time. Probably not a ton, but if we're really crammed into a corner and for bracketing creativity and fairness and as far as matchups, I think that the committee would be willing to shift a host, quote unquote, shift a host to maybe one of those other schools, other sites, to be able to bring more teams together and put together a more balanced bracket. We'll have to see. With NPI, we'll know what quote unquote true seeding would be, but we'll have to see how creative the committee is able to get within there. But as Zach said before, hosting for anyone 1 through 64 is not guaranteed just based on your seeding.
Let's go on to the picks, Matt.
All right, here are our pick slate from last week. Let's see how we did against it. The first game was Denison at Worcester. That was a half-point line in favor of the home team, but Denison won that one 77-65, Zach. I actually don't have the picks here. Oh, we both picked Denison, so we both get the points. Baruch Lehman was one we talked about at some length. It was a half-point line. It ended up only being a 1-point scoring margin, and Lehman got the win there. We both went with Baruch plus a half a point, which means we were half a point incorrect, but that means we still get 0 credit for that game. So we fall to 1-1. Swarthmore Gettysburg was a big one out in the Centennial Conference. Zach, you and I both went with Swarthmore plus the 3 points, but Gettysburg won by 7 and got the win and covered our computer line on that one. Belhaven and Maryville was a massive one in the CCS standings. Belhaven got the win by 8. The line was a half a point in favor of Maryville. Zach, we split the decision there, but I won the point going with Belhaven to win or to cover that spread, and they did. And our D3 Datacast game of the week was one we talked about in the top 25, Wesleyan and Trinity, Connecticut. It was a half-point line, but Wesleyan won that game by 9 on the road. Zach, we split that decision as well, but I was the one that got the point there. So my week ended up at 3-2. You were just 1-4. You fall to 27, 31-2 overall, where I rise to 30, 28-2. You have a few games of catching up to do.
I do, yeah. The split decisions did not go in my favor.
No, I got both of those, which really helped me out. So here's this week's picks. As always, if you want to follow along at home, post them in a comments below in YouTube or tweet to us at D3 Datacast because our account is no longer suspended for those that you were following that saga. The first game here is a big one up in the NUMAC. It's Babson at WPI. WPI is 2.5-point favorites at home, but who do you like against that computer line?
We talked earlier about the NUMAC race, Matt. I would not be surprised if Babson won this at all, but WPI feels like they've been the more consistent team, even if the highs haven't been as high, maybe the lows haven't been as low. Give me WPI at home.
Yeah, I'm going to go more feels and vibes as well on this one and go with WPI. It feels like they're about to take command of the new Mac race. This is their opportunity to show it. It still is 2.5, so they could win the game and not cover that. But I think if they win this game, chances are maybe it's by 3 or more. So I'm going to go WPI. Going out to the American Rivers Conference, Nebraska Wesleyan versus Dubuque. 1.5 point underdogs are the Prairie Wolves on the road. But Zach, what's your pick?
Yeah, I didn't make the pick in our conference champions draft map, but I think Nebraska Wesleyan was my favorite coming into the year. And they're right there. I will take them even on the road against Dubuque.
Yeah, I think Dubuque is the one on top of the standings right now. Nebraska Wesleyan is the team that I favor, and I think the computer ratings favor. It's a 1.5 point spread on the road, which means maybe the computers do think Nebraska Wesleyan is slightly better. But I think the margins there is bigger than the computer thinks. So I'm going to go with Nebraska Wesleyan as well. Give us 2 picks in the same direction for that one. Our third game up is a coast to coast conference, non conference matchup between UC Santa Cruz and Salisbury. This one is going to be at Salisbury. UC Santa Cruz is making one of their trips out east here. 5.5 point computer line in favor of the home Salisbury side. Zach, what is your pick?
I'm going to go banana slugs on this one. Matt, I know that's a team that you've been dying to talk about at various points throughout the year, but it seems like every time they do something like, get a win over Denison, they do something to kind of fall off. And Salisbury is another hard team to figure out, just a wide range of results. Give me the 5.5 points here with Santa Cruz.
Yeah, this will be a fun game to follow. I think both of these teams have had some pretty high highs this season, so we'll see what happens when they match up with each other. But I'm going to make things pretty boring and go the same direction as you 3 times in a row. I'm going to go with the Banana Slugs plus the 5.5. I know that's a big trip all the way out from coast to coast. That's the conference name, so I guess that's why they're doing it. But so you never know how the travel is going to affect a team. But 5.5, I think this can be a competitive game here, so I'm going to go with UC Santa Cruz. Staying out a little closer to home to us for this one, Zach. We're going to the CCIW, North Central Illinois plus 4 points at Augustana. What is your pick?
Uh, yeah, I think this will be a tight one. So this might be a little bit regrettable to be laying 4 points, but give me Augustana at home.
Okay. All right. Well, we're gonna have our first confrontation here. I'm gonna go with North Central Illinois, and the reason why is North Central had that big overtime game against Illinois Wesleyan, so that means they must be really really good, and so I think that they can cover 4 points on the road at Augustana. And our D3 Datacast game of the week, two teams we saw in my top 25 ballot, a big one in the ODAC race. Randolph Macon are 1.5 point road favorites at Virginia Wesleyan. What do you like in that game?
I think it's just a program. Bet against them at your own risk, Matt. Give me Randolph Macon.
Yeah, no one ever went broke picking Randolph Macon in D3 Datacast picks, did they? I think that's my pick as well. Randolph Macon. I mean, this is a big game. This is an opportunity for Virginia Wesleyan to get one of those signature wins that I mentioned I was looking for. But I don't think that they're going to get it necessarily. I think Randolph Macon's going to take care of business, cover the 1.5 line on the road, and put themselves in strong position in the ODAC battle. So that's our picks.
Hopefully, it goes better than last week.
All right, Zach, we have a mailbag.
Couple items here in the mailbag. Matt, PJ Rabel sent this one in through our website. Thought it would be a good one to explain to everyone because I think we've seen some questions on this topic come up. Curious why Dubuque shows adjusted wins of 13.1 and 12.5 is the highest minimum wins for everyone else. Thanks. So yeah, we did our big NPI episode here for men's and women's basketball. For men's basketball, 12.5 wins is the minimum wins dial setting. So any win that would hurt your NPI above or after you've included 12.5, and of course the 0.5 only makes sense because there is a home and away multiplier that's factored in. So one game does not equal necessarily one adjusted game in terms of NPI, and your overall NPI is the weighted average of your individual game NPIs. So you have to count at least 12 and a half before you can start dropping any wins that would lower your NPI if they were added in, right? So that's the case. So for like the top ranked teams, for the most part, they're just at that 12.5 because they've got a bunch of really good wins, and that's keeping their and not many losses that are hurting their NPI. So by the time you add in, the 12.5, going beyond that, typically for top ranked teams is gonna hurt them. So it just is capped at the 12.5. Um, so Dubuque is going beyond that 12.5 because they have additional wins that, when added in, would raise their NPI, would help them. And then anything, once it stops helping them, once it starts hurting your NPI, once you're beyond 12 and a half, that can get dropped from consideration. And that's what's happening with Dubuque, but they're not alone in that. I think, Matt, I was looking through Westfield State as of Sunday, I believe was keeping 14.2. I think that's maybe the largest number that's there right now. And there certainly are some others.
Yeah, 12.5 minimum wins. You have to keep that many wins in your NPI score if you have. If you have them, you got to keep them. But you're allowed to keep more if they all help you. So some teams um, will stop at that 12 and a half adjusted win. Some teams will go beyond.
Yeah, I've seen it said that NPI is really about getting the 12.5 best wins you can, and you certainly do want to get that. But if you have any beyond that would help your NPI, those certainly count as well. It's not just about getting the best 12.5. If you're 13.5 and that helps you, that counts as well. So
Yep.
just a little important note there, as it's the minimum wins dial, right? You can have more than the minimum, but you need to include at least the 12.5. And for women's basketball, just it's the same thing, except for that number is 15. All right, one
Um,
more here. Next one, Matt, comes from Mike Navarre. Is Tufts Wesleyan on January 31st the game of the year so far? We were talking offline, and I think retroactively you look back, and there's some games that you could talk about as game of the year, whether we knew it or not at that point. But certainly if you look at the top 20, the d3hoops.com top 25, we had sort of a game of the year with Wesleyan taking on Trinity, Connecticut. So it's a bit of a moving target, if you ask me. But
yeah,
Tufts Wesleyan certainly looks like a great game.
a really good game. Yeah, in the mix for that distinction, if we wanted to. Illinois Wesleyan versus UW Platteville, two teams that are still highly ranked. Illinois Wesleyan versus Wash U. That's another game against two teams that are probably going to be highly ranked. So yeah, a few other ones like Emory versus NYU looked really, really good when that one was happening. A little bit less good right now, but still a great one. Forgetting if we came up with one or two more. Oh, Randolph Macon and Hampton Sydney played twice. I think those are both really good ones. So I think games like that are all in the mix. I don't want to say like which one is better or worse right now. But if we go to the end of the year and say what was like the best average rating between two teams in a game, this is maybe one that will be kind of among the leaders as well. Yeah.
All right, that wraps up this week's mailbag. If you have something for us to address in a future episode, you can leave it as a comment on YouTube on this episode here. You can find us on social media at D3Datacast on our no longer suspended Twitter X account. Not sure what that was all about, but we're back. And Facebook, Instagram, we're there. Find us. If you have something for us to address, you can send us a message.
All right, Zach.
Word of thanks on our way out, Matt, for everyone who's supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/D3Datacast. So grateful for their financial support, Matt. We make everything available on d3datacast.com, the daily NPI updates. We're running NPI simulations for people who might be interested in how things could play out at the end of the year. We've got efficiency ratings. That's all there on d3datacast.com. There are no ads on the site. There's no logging in to get behind the paywall. It's all free and available for the entire Division III community, thanks to these people who've taken on the voluntary subscription approach and chosen to support us financially. It's an honor that they've chosen to do so, and we're so grateful.
Yeah, it's fairly inexpensive. There's a $3 tier and a $5 tier. If you're interested in helping us do this D3 data cause, you can go to patreon.com/D3datacast and join us as well. I just made that up on the spot, Zach. So give me
We're gonna have to run by the marketing department.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Fun episode, Zach. We talked about 25 teams. We talked about the next 25 teams and beyond. We're about ready to turn the page into February. Our next episode will launch after this one. Will launch in February. So that is the stretch run. Things get real fast here. So it's a fun time for Division III basketball, Zach. It was a fun episode as well. But for now, we're going to say Good job, team.